Hey guys, welcome to Shine with Jessie. I am super excited to be talking with you guys as usual because I love you. Alright, so this last Sunday was Easter. It is one of my absolute favorite days of the year because it is the day that Jesus rose from the grave, defeated sin, defeated death, and saved us all, right? It is amazing. It's a truly amazing day, and I love that we get to come together as a family and celebrate it together. I think that it would have been really cool to be there when it happened, when Jesus came back after thinking that, he died and he was just gone, and that after thinking we would never be able to see this awesome person ever again, to have him come back only a few days later and surprise the world and save the world. And I think that being one of his disciples would have been one of the most amazing experiences ever, to be able to spend all that time with Jesus. When he came back from the grave, his disciples, I'm sure they were surprised, but they were all super excited and super happy, right? I mean, their best friend came back. Their teacher, their rabbi, their closest friend that they had been traveling and living with for years of their life. He came back for them, and I think that's really cool. So there's one of his disciples, though, who has been dubbed Doubting Thomas. And if you don't know the story about Thomas, and why he's called Doubting Thomas, when Jesus came back, all the disciples were in the upper room, and Jesus had come in and he had shown himself to them, except Thomas wasn't there. He was the only one who was not there. And Jesus had left, and Thomas came, and all the disciples were telling him how he had come back, how Jesus was alive again, how he was no longer dead, he was no longer buried, the tomb was empty. And Thomas, he said that unless he saw the holes in his hands and the cut in his side, that he wouldn't believe that Jesus had been raised from the dead. Now, that, you know what? That does sound like someone who doubts, right? That sounds what a doubter would sound like, right? Like someone saying, I would not believe in this thing unless I had proof. That sounds really appropriate. But I really think that we've been giving Thomas this unfair nickname throughout all of history, because when you think about it, just a few days before, his teacher died. One of his closest friends, somebody who he cared and loved about, he had to watch him on the cross in misery and in this really, really brutal state. And I think that the reason he said that he wouldn't believe that Jesus had come back was because he didn't want to open his heart to the possibility of it being broken again. He didn't want to think about, what if all these guys are just saying this so that, as a practical joke or something? What if they were just messing with him? What if they were saying that Jesus was back because they knew that's what he wanted to hear? What if, all of it was wrong? And I can see how that would be really, really hard for Thomas, to watch his rabbi, broken and beaten on the cross and buried, only to be told a few days later that he's come back. I would have a hard time believing that too. I think that I really not want to open my heart to that, because I wouldn't want to have my heart broken when it had just been torn to shreds the Friday before. And there are times in life that we're all like that, right? We don't want to open the possibility of belief in things. When I was growing up, my brother and we didn't get along at all. My brother, Skylar, was kind of a bully to me, but I was back to him too. We would fight, we would bicker, we would beat each other up. There was one time he tried to drown me, and I now have this terrible fear of swimming pools, which I know is completely off topic, but that's just part of my story. My brother and I did not get along. We hated each other. We were not a great fit. And I remember thinking when I was in junior high that my brother would never care about me, that we were never meant to have this brother-sister relationship that I, like, all my friends with siblings had with their siblings, like, because it felt like my brother just hated me, and it felt like I kind of hated him too. And I just didn't see us ever caring about each other in a good and healthy way. We were just too mean to each other. And when I was in junior high, my great-grandmother, my Granny Great, she got really, really sick, and she had to go to the hospital. This lady was 91 years old, so it wasn't a surprise to any of us that this was happening, but like, she was one of my favorite relatives. This lady was amazing. She was super cool. She was super kind. She loved Jesus. She followed the Bible. She had a great faith, and she passed it down to her daughter, my grandma, who passed it down to her daughter, who passed it down to me. And she was kind of the foundation of my faith. And I got to grow up knowing this really, really amazing woman. And when we had learned that she was dying because she was old, it was really, really hard. And I remember thinking, like, how are we ever gonna get through this? She's my Granny Great. She's one of my closest friends. She would play Go Fish with me every time I went over to her house, and she would, like, let me color on any piece of paper that she had in the house, and she would hang up whatever picture I drew on the fridge. She was somebody who was really, really important to me. And she was in the hospital, and we knew that she wasn't gonna leave. And I remember thinking, like, I was having a really, really hard time with this. My brother and I were fighting. My grandma was my great-grandma was likely not going to leave the hospital. And I was struggling. And one night at youth group, my youth pastor, Ben, like one of my most favorite people on earth, Ben, he's awesome. He did something a little different this Wednesday night at youth group. He did an altar call. If you don't know what that is, it's when when the preacher or pastor or whoever calls you up to come to the altar to pray. Now, we didn't have an altar. We just had this stage that was just like raised wood. And so he called us to come pray at the stage, at the edge of the stage. And I went over there. And that Wednesday night, like, that wasn't a normal thing for us. We normally just would stay in our seats when we prayed. But tonight, for whatever reason, he did the altar call. So I went to the edge of the stage with my best friend, Alex, and we started to pray together. And I remember thinking, like, I was in a really bad place. I was losing one of my favorite people on earth. My brother didn't seem to care about me. There was just a lot going on, and I was just praying for a sign that, I was cared about, that God loved me, that maybe Skylar, my brother, loved me, that I needed something to know that I was loved. And I kept thinking this over and over and over and praying to God, like, just show me you love me. Just show me you love me. Because I can't believe it right now, because there's just too much bad stuff going on. And I was praying this over and over again. And as I was praying, I felt this hand on my back. And I was like, okay, we're putting hands over each other while we pray. That's a pretty normal church thing to do, is when you lay hands on somebody to pray with them. And so we finished praying, and I get up, and I turn around to see who was praying with me. I expected it to be one of the youth sponsors, or maybe another one of my friends in the youth group. But it was Skylar. It was my brother. And he and I were both kind of just in tears. We were crying over the fact that we were losing our great-grandma. We were crying over this prayer that we were praying together that we didn't even realize we were kind of praying the same thing. But it was just this crazy moment where I felt a sudden rush of love, of feeling like I had this burden lifted from me. And just 5 minutes before this has happened, I didn't even really believe that anybody cared about me in that moment when all this crazy and awful stuff was going on. And then God proved himself. He showed up, and he answered my prayer. And my brother showed up, and he talked with me, and we had a conversation after youth group that night about where we both were. And we were still not best friends after that moment. We are a lot closer now, Sky and I. He is one of my closest friends now, but when I was 13, we were still struggled. But I knew that despite the fact that he and I had been fighting all the time, despite the fact that like we claimed not to care or love about each other, I knew that he cared anyways. And I knew that I cared about him too. And I knew that God brought him to me in that moment. And it was one of the most amazing moments in my life, especially in youth group. And it was a really, really cool experience for me to have. Now, when Thomas said that he wouldn't believe until he saw Jesus himself and until he saw his wounds, Jesus delivered. He came back and he showed Thomas, and he allowed him to touch the holes in his hands and to see the cut in his side, and to show that he was really God and he was really Jesus. And Thomas just started weeping, and he came to his feet and he said, "My God, my Lord," and he was praising Jesus. And it was this amazing moment of clarity for Thomas. It was this amazing moment where he knew that his friends weren't messing with him, that nobody was lying, that his teacher, his rabbi, his friend had come back, that he had really and truly come back. And I think that that's something that we need to remember right now, that Jesus comes back, right? He doesn't let the grave stop him. He doesn't let doubt stop him. He doesn't let death or sin or anything stop him. He's always and constantly coming back to us, and he's always and constantly chasing after our hearts, even when we have bad relationships with our siblings, or even when we're grieving somebody, or even when we're stuck inside all day and we don't know when we're going to be able to leave our house or go to school or see our friends. That in the midst of the chaos of our world, in the midst of all the scary and confusing times, Jesus always comes back, and he comes running to us with open arms. So I hope you guys remember that you are loved. I love you. God loves you. You're loved, my friends. And I will see you again on Sunday. Bye, guys.